Okay, everyone, welcome back from lunch. I hope everybody got enough to eat. So we're going to kick off this afternoon with an invited talk looking at the regulatory landscape for emerging contaminants. And with us we have Catherine Janasie from the National Sea Grant Law Center. She is Senior Research Counsel, and the National Sea Grant Law Center is located at the University of Mississippi School of Law. And Catherine provides legal and policy analyses to organizations and government entities on ocean, coastal, and natural resources issues, and is a member of the law school faculty. Kathy received her LLM in Environmental and Natural Resources Law from Lewis and Clark Law School, and her JD and BA from Rutgers University. So, help me welcome Kathy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about the regulation of mostly PFAS, because as I'll get into in my talk, we have been getting consistent questions about emerging contaminants from our Sea Grant partners at the Law Center. But mostly what we're seeing on the regulatory scale is the regulation of PFAS as compared to other kind of emerging contaminants. So for those of you who don't know what the National Sea Grant Law Center is, we were founded in 2002. I lost my slides on here, but that's fine. Yeah. And so one of our main purposes at the Law Center is to get questions from the Sea Grant state programs about things that they're facing. And so starting, I would say, around the time of COVID, we saw a lot of interest on the regulation of emerging contaminants in particular. And then as we started working on these issues, really focusing in on Okay. And so starting around COVID, definitely at Sea Grant, we saw more of a push to start working on contaminants of emerging concern. And through that, we got funding for two main projects, one focused in the Great Lakes with Illinois, Indiana Sea Grant, and then one in the Southeast that we've been working with on Georgia and South Carolina Sea Grant. And so both of those have really turned into PFAS projects because that is what we have found on the regulatory landscape. And so really most of what I'm going to talk the rest of my time on is kind of what we've seen on PFAS. So in this last handful of years, we've been tracking both what we've been seeing on the federal level. And so the federal government consistency between kind of the different administrations have had a very consistent focus on PFAS. That's unique. I would say in environmental law, we've seen a lot of back and forth in law and policy between particularly kind of Obama to Trump, Trump to Biden, back to Trump. With PFAS, they've been very consistent, I would say, about kind of wanting to regulate PFAS. And so I'm going to talk about kind of the actions that they've taken under federal law as well. And then I'll just touch on briefly kind of what we've seen on the state level as we go through these different kind of aspects of PFAS regulation. We're in the process of actually looking at all the kind of coastal states in the United States. So we're in progress to get that. So this is definitely ongoing research that we have at the Law Center. And I'll say off the top that PFAS regulation is always changing, especially here in the Great Lakes region. The states are always kind of updating what they've been doing. So I wanted to show just a couple images to really hit home on kind of some of the regulatory issues you face with PFAS. So PFAS come from all places in the environment, kind of this ubiquitous amounts of sources. And so from the regulatory landscape, if you're thinking about being a regulator, this is kind of an imposing thing to look at, to think about all the different ways that PFAS are getting into our environment and the different impacts that they're having. And so, how we regulate them in consumer goods and firefighting foams is going to impact what's going to the wastewater treatment plants. It's going to impact what's in our biosolids sludge that's then going to go onto farms. And then what's leaching into drinking water wells, both through surface water and groundwater. And so there's a lot going on with PFAS. And so kind of where do we want to attack, where we're going to go first to try to keep them from being in the environment, and then how do we remediate them once they're there. And then the second one I just want to show is, this is from the Environmental Working Group. So they have a PFAS tracker where they show kind of every place PFAS are being found in different studies. And so they're everywhere where they find them. And so from a regulatory landscape, that's another challenge in itself, is thinking about, okay, we have these, group of chemicals that are everywhere in the environment. They're getting into the environment all these different ways, and now we have them all these places. How are we going to be able to remediate them once we find them? And so through our research, we've been trying to kind of make these kind of regulatory buckets or pathways of where we're seeing kind of regulatory action on both the federal and state level. And so this is, again, an ever-evolving list. And so with drinking water, we see either them setting hard regulatory values, which are known as maximum contaminant levels, as well as health-based values related for kind of guidance for drinking water, designating, some of the PFAS as hazardous substances, surface and groundwater protections, and then looking more specifically at product restrictions. So we see a lot of regulation on firefighting foam, but consumer packaging, food packaging, carpets, rugs, everything you could think of. Some of the states are starting to regulate it. Food consumption advisories, mostly we see it with fish consumption advisories. And then biosolids is, an area that we've seen the last couple of years really pick up a lot of steam. The other thing I'll say as, we start to get into it, because I get this question a lot, is, the regulation is really focusing on the PFAS that we know the most about right now. So PFOS, PFOA, and so that's another regulatory challenge in itself, is you have this huge group of compounds, and then how are we going to regulate them as a group or one by one or by categories? And so this is a good website, Safer States, and they have a regulatory tracker. And so it is a good way to get kind of a quick and dirty look at kind of what's happening on a state level. What they're tracking is past and introduced legislation, and so it's not all-encompassing, but it is a good way to kind of get a snapshot of what's happening. And so when you look at what's happening in Safer States, there's a lot of action on the state level throughout the country related to PFAS. Bills are getting introduced, every legislative session in most states to try to look at PFAS regulation. And so it's always kind of an evolving landscape for us as we're starting to look at what's happening. And so I'm going to show you a couple slides in a second, but before I put that, I want to show kind of what the attributes I'm going to be talking about on these couple of slides. And so at the Law Center, once we started tracking, we started looking at, what's been enacted legislation, enacted regulations, and then we really noticed that there was a lot happening beyond just strict kind of law and regulations on the PFAS. And so we've been tracking kind of agency actions, so agencies can take all kinds of regulatory actions that are not laws or regulation. And so we've been trying to track those to get a bigger kind of snapshot of what's going on. A lot of states are focusing particularly on giving money to colleges to do research. A lot of us are funded our own work based on kind of these pots of money that have been coming out. But we see big differences between the regions. So this is our working draft of kind of what we've seen in the Southeast. And so the Southeast, we see a lot of agency actions that aren't necessarily law or regulations. We see a lot of appropriations. We see a lot of partnerships with universities to help fund research. This is in comparison to the Great Lakes, where we see a lot more regulatory action. And so this is definitely a draft image for us in the Great Lakes, but I wanted to show it just so you could get a picture of kind of everything on the regulatory scale that we see here, particularly in this region and kind of what states are doing. And so we see a lot of action, particularly in firefighting foam, drinking water, consumer products, hazardous substances. But what we found at the Law Center is once we take this and look at it, so I'll highlight firefighting foam, we consistently see past legislation. Every state has passed legislation except Pennsylvania in this region. But then when we actually went in to look at the laws themselves, the actual law and regulations varied quite a bit. And so though we could say, yes, everyone's acting, the way that they're structuring those regulatory bans is very different. So some states are saying you can't use PFAS at all in firefighting foam. Some are saying don't use them in training exercises. Some are saying don't use them in testing. Some are saying you can't manufacture or sell them in the state. All of these may or may not have a loophole that they can get out of if it's an emergency situation. Some states have said, notify us when you're using it. Some have said, we'll collect all the ones we're banning so you know what to do with it afterwards. Some are testing firefighters to see their blood levels. And so all of this to say that it can be very complicated, to look at a chart like this and say, okay, everyone's acting. And then you dig down deeper, it's a lot more nuanced than that, even with PFAS. So getting into kind of these different regulatory pathways. So I'm sure a lot of you know that in 2024, the EPA said that they were going to regulate a handful of PFAS chemicals in drinking water. And so PFOA and PFOS, they set final enforceable maximum contaminant levels. And then they did these other handful of chemicals as well. And the last one I will highlight is this mixture of these handful of chemicals, and they decided to regulate that based on a hazard index. And so they said to the public water systems, you're going to have to start monitoring in 2027. You're going to have to start treating for these in 2029. So that immediately got sued by different people, chemicals companies. Actually, the public water systems themselves filed the lawsuit based on this idea, one, that it wasn't really achievable to meet some of these standards in general, but then they really focused on those other handful of chemicals. So one, the lawsuit is saying you have no authority to do this mixture kind of regulatory limit. You just made that up. You've never done it before. You can't do that. And then two, those other handful of chemicals, the lawsuit is saying you don't have the science yet to regulate these. And so we understand PFOA and PFOS, but those ones we do not think we can regulate. And so this lawsuit is still ongoing. And so as it's ongoing, last May, the administration said, actually, we're going to get rid of all those other standards. We're going to keep PFOA and keep PFOS, but the other ones we want to get away. The other thing they said was we're going to move the compliance date back, and so it gives the kind of public water systems the chance to kind of, get up to speed and pay for all of this. And in that lawsuit that's still ongoing, the federal government has actually tried to say to the courts, take away all the lawsuits on the ones that I have dotted in red, because we don't think we're going to keep them. And at this point in time, the courts have said, you haven't formally withdrawn them, and so they're staying in the lawsuit. And so even with something that we think we had something solid, I think at this point we can say PFOA and PFOS are going to stay around, but we're still in kind of this limbo about these other contaminants that we're trying to regulate at some point in time. And then when we look at the state level, so this is the ones, again, in this kind of Great Lakes, Lake Champlain region that have been regulated. And what I want to highlight here is just kind of how the variation in the levels that were set. And so the Great Lakes states are all predating what was done by the EPA, but they're kind of all over the place, the numbers that the states came up with. And so part of the argument is the EPA's one is too low, which if you look at it compared to kind of what the other states does, it's a lot lower than what the states did. But this is a huge, from a regulatory standpoint, challenge with PFAS is kind of this, what is the science saying? Do we have enough science to regulate? What's the level that the regulated entities can achieve? And so I think this slide is a good way to kind of show kind of where we are with kind of understanding we want to regulate, but how are we going to regulate? What standard are we going to set? And what are we going to require of the regulated community? So surface water, the Biden administration put out draft effluent limitations for surface water, Clean Water Act permits in 2020. I think sometime in 2024, the Trump administration withdrew those right away once they came in January 2025. They said they have an intent to do their own effluent limitation guidelines. We haven't seen those yet. But then again, we see kind of states stepping in to fill the gap for the federal government so that, environmental law, that's a lot of how it works is the federal government can say either here's guidance or here's our own way we're going to regulate, and then the states can kind of step in and kind of fill that gap. And so in the Great Lakes, we have seen, these handful of states kind of stepping in and saying we're going to set our own limits, at least when we're thinking about writing Clean Water Act discharge permits for regulated entities, to think about kind of what the PFAS we want to see coming out of those in the limit. The other thing that we've seen under the Clean Water Act is that, again, the EPA has kind of given these guidance values out to kind of help states as they're starting to implement their own programs and thinking about how to regulate PFAS. And so they said, here are the highest concentrations of pollutants that we would want to see that is going to allow fish and other aquatic species to live, grow, and reproduce. And then the states are supposed to take these, as well as your tribe, and think about them when they're developing their own water quality standards. And so this is just another kind of regulatory kind of interaction between the federal and the state government, where we see federal EPA kind of saying, here's your guidance value, states, now you take these and kind of think about how you want to implement them on the state level. They've also issued this long list of contaminants to look at for fish and shellfish advisory programs. And so again, saying to the states, we're starting to see kind of these come up in the environment. We're concerned about them in fish and shellfish, particularly because people are going to start eating them. And so we want to regulate them. We get a ton of questions at the Law Center in particular about kind of fish advisories because we walk this fine line of trying to tell people we want them to eat fish because it's healthy, and then at the same time having state governments saying, oh, but they also have all these other contaminants. So we've handled that for a long time with mercury. saying, don't eat so much fish because you don't want to get kind of mercury. Now we're starting to see it with PFAS. And so kind of how do we balance that messaging in between fish is such this healthy protein for you, it's so good, it has all these health benefits. At the same time, it may have this handful of PFAS in it that you may not want to be eating. So I would definitely say this, as well as kind of a evolving regulatory landscape on kind of thinking about what the messaging should be about, consuming fish. And so biosolids is definitely an area with PFAS that I would say the last 2 years has picked up a lot of attention. And that is because there have been some work starting to show that PFAS are showing up both in kind of the soil on farms as well in agricultural products. So I think it was a study out of Texas showed there was PFAS in the soil, PFAS in the cattle, PFAS in the milk. And where that's coming from is that the EPA for a long time has encouraged agricultural producers in the United States to use sewage sludge as fertilizers on farm. We are now learning that that is full with tons of PFAS. And so kind of we've had this regulatory choice where it said this is a great use of fertilizer, a great way to reuse it, to put it on farms, and now it's okay, now all your farms are contaminated with PFAS. And so how are we going to handle that? It's another messaging problem because we don't want to tell people not to eat locally grown food or products, at the same time dealing with, okay, they may all have PFAS in it. So how are we going to handle dealing with that? So EPA in January 2025 issued this draft sewage sludge risk assessment. And what they really focused on in this was thinking about people, what they called the family farm. So farmers who are living at the farm, and they're kind of eating everything coming from the farm. And so not even really concerned about us as consumers, but really the farm families themselves. And what they found was they said that PFOA contaminated products had a higher health risk for the family farm than PFAS contaminated ones. They said that PFOA, milk, water, beef, and eggs, they had not as high of a risk as these other ones with PFOS. And so they kind of said, all right, states, look at this as you're starting to think about how you want to maybe regulate this in the state. This is, again, just a screen share shot of what was on Safer States. I did this a month ago. And so again, we're seeing legislation at the state level really starting to be introduced on kind of how to regulate biosolids in agriculture. And so again, kind of towing this line like we saw with fish, but we don't want to necessarily, they don't necessarily want to shut down farms or encourage not to use kind of farm products, but then how are we going to deal with knowing that there's PFAS? And so there's been very drastic steps by the state. So Maine has been, shutting down farms and trying to transition these farm families on contaminated land, where in other states we don't see that kind of drastic kind of approach. In the Great Lakes, we're starting to see strategies that they're issuing to kind of deal with this and to try to say, okay, maybe we should start testing biosolids before we start applying them to land. And so kind of how are we going to start kind of implementing a regulatory program to at least start at a point where we're going to stop putting this on the land if it's going to have a lot of PFAS in it. So definitely, again, something that is moving pretty quickly on biosolids and continues to see action. And then federal government has also designated PFOA and PFOS again as hazardous substances under the CERCLA, also known as the Superfund law. And what's interesting about this designation is CERCLA is a pretty strict liability statute. And so if you were someone who applied a hazardous substance to a piece of property under CERCLA, you are potentially a responsible party for that cleanup. And so when EPA set this out, at the same time, they also put out this enforcement discretion policy because they said, We don't want this to mean that farmers who are using contaminated biosludge are now liable under CERCLA. And we don't want to see wastewater treatment plants that are also applying kind of what their sewage sludge for how they're handling it to also be liable under it. So they said that this designation is really meant to be for kind of the higher level entities who are either manufacturing or putting them out in the environment, and not necessarily farmers and wastewater treatment plants. And so, again, just to highlight, we're focusing again on mostly those two PFAS compounds, again, based on what the science has. About half the states in the Great Lakes have actually taken action related to hazardous substances. Illinois here has published levels for 11 compounds, and that they're saying that they think that needs to be protected for human health. Groundwater remediation standards in Michigan to think about how we're going to clean up these sources that have been contaminated, and then these other kind of handful on the state level of kind of designating and starting to notice that we need to start regulating kind of once they get into the environment, what we're going to do with them. So with that, I will just thank kind of our funders. So a lot of this work has been funded through Purdue University, through Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, as well as the National Sea Grant College Program. And I'm happy to take any questions kind of you all have on kind of this broad overview. Thank you.
Questions?
Hi, thank you for that presentation. Just noticed that on the list of PFAS that have been considered for regulation, PTFE was not included, which in some of our research has found it's the most common and most widely used. Do you know why that's not considered?
I would say, I don't know, I can't say for sure. I would say for some reason that's interesting to think about, it's either not on the regulator's radar, or they think at this point they don't have the science to set a regulatory level. But that is definitely something interesting to think about, kind of why, if the scientific community is saying we're finding this, why they aren't regulating it.
It's a polymer, PFAS.
Yeah.
So it's just not environmentally relevant.
Okay.
So like a lot of the really large PFAS releases are through the manufacturer of PTFE. So PTFE is the polymer, but they would have maybe released the other PFAS in the environment. It's just...
Okay. That's why I have scientists here to tell me things. I'm just a lawyer.
Thanks for your talk. I think this morning during the keynote, a question came up about sort of like broader, larger changes to regulatory frameworks. Do you, in your research and sort of collaborations, think that there's appetite, I guess, for that among lawyers and policymakers, or do you feel like folks who are working in that realm are more interested in making developments within the current sort of CERCLA, et cetera, kind of framework?
I think definitely the appetite is to operate within the existing laws and policies, as opposed to saying, let's write a new law, the Emerging Contaminant Regulatory Policy Act of whatever. Definitely using kind of the existing laws. And that, I would say that is true across all of environmental law, is to try to kind of put them in those things. I will say that, the keynote this morning, talking about the pharmaceuticals, we get questions all the time at pharmaceuticals, and there's definitely not been the appetite to touch that and thinking about, oh, maybe we don't want all this metformin in the environment. How are we going to regulate that? I would say there has not been the appetite to do that at all.
Do you know if there's any notable funding initiatives on the federal or state level to help the remediation of PFAS in different areas?
So I would say the states have been pretty active in trying to pass money pots. And so going back, to like this slide or even this southeast where it's easier to see, kind of anytime you see like that dollar bill, a lot of times that money is to remediate some kind of contamination. Sometimes it's very site specific, seeing, okay, we have this one bloom that we really want to address and they're passing money for, but I would say that there has been efforts to totally remediate through those pots of money.
Can I ask you about the failed policy? What is the metric for a failed policy?
What that icon means?
Yes, how do you measure when a policy fails?
And so that just means someone introduced a law and it never got passed by the House. And so that's not saying, oh, this policy was bad. That's saying we had some regulator at the state level introduce a law to try to regulate something in PFAS, and it just never got to actually be passed and enacted by the government. But that's good feedback. We might want to change what we call that.